It's 999,000 and change Bangladeshi downloads, which means they're Bangladeshi robot downloads, which, by the way, is my favorite band in college.
I know. Well, and expectations have changed.
People wanted that click play, start podcast now.
Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast.
Okay, welcome. We are here with one of the OG, both CacheFly supporters and podcast supporters. Paul, how the hell are you?
I am the hell great, man. It is fun to finally get on here. It took till season 2 for it to happen, but it's good to be here, man.
That's how it goes. But I'm glad you're on here as well. We were, speaking of season 2, we were just at Podcast Movement together, and it seems like season 2 might be the season of podcasters. It's been a while since I went to a podcasting event, and obviously things have changed. We've been doing podcast things and stuff since 2006 or something crazy at CacheFly. But this is your daily. How have you seen things evolve? Like where are we at in the podcasting life cycle?
We're in a really interesting place because, you get 10 people at Podcast Movement, put them up against the wall and have all 10 of them give their definition of podcasting, and you'll probably get 10 different things. So there's a bit of confusion, but there's a lot more money. And because there's a lot more money, a lot more people are coming in that are adding the confusion. It gets really interesting. And then, of course, you throw in the role of AI in the midst of the money and the confusion, and things get really, really interesting. But at the same time, I'm entering my third decade of this. I've been doing this for 20 years. And we have learned a lot along the way of how to get through the confusion, how to get through the AI, how to deal with the money. And it's an interesting place. So, next year we'll be 21 and we can finally buy a drink. But it's interesting times right now.
Yeah. Well, I jumped the gun a bit. So for those who don't know you, who are you? How'd you get here? And in 2 minutes or less, what are you selling so that we can all get people to fast forward past what you're selling and get to the good stuff?
In 2000, actually, I got a vision for audio online. Don Katz, Audible, had dinner with him, and he presented a vision for audio that just blew my mind. And Audible continues to dominate in a certain space of that today. I wanted in 2000. I couldn't get in because it was $500,000 to get in. They got 70%. We got 30%, and they just signed Tom Clancy and Harry Potter. So I was going to play that game. 2004, podcasting pops up. And what podcasting represented to me at the time was now I can play Audible. It's actually gotten a lot bigger. It's gotten a lot more exciting. But the idea of someone with a message being able to distribute it without censors, without distribution requirements, without anything, directly to the audience, spam free, was really, really exciting to me. So I started from day one. Did not make money until at least a decade into it, but was there from the beginning. The first podcast event where you and I met. I love to tell everybody that at the end of the podcast event, the entire podcast event met in the hotel bar afterwards. There was a page of podcasts available at the time. Now it's gotten slightly bigger. So I run a company called the Podcast Partnership. We partner with people to help get their podcast out the door.
Okay. So big topic that we both stumbled on at Movement. The AI overlords are coming, or they're already here, and we're afraid of them taking over more. Seemed to be a lot of FUD going on. How do you see AI changing the landscape?
Let's talk about the FUD first. Because podcasting means 10 different things to 10 different people, there are different assignations of the value in the midst of all of this. For some, it is art. And the idea of going into the cutting room and sculpting the perfect sonic soundscape for your podcast adventure is really exciting to some. And the idea that AI might take that away. There are a lot of editors who are afraid of losing their art. There are a lot of by-the-hour editors who are afraid of losing some work. Writers for show notes, this kind of stuff, all these things. There are some who put a great deal of value into it. There are some who have found a great deal of value in it. And AI really, really shakes that up in some ways that people have to discern. And I think this at the end is going to be a good thing, but I think it's going to be bloody at the beginning. everybody should ask what role AI plays in their podcast. The joke is, in AI, they say you're not going to be replaced by AI. You're going to be replaced by someone who uses AI. And
Right.
I'd say the exact same thing to be true for podcasts. Your podcast is not going to be replaced with an AI podcast. It's going to be replaced with a podcast that uses AI to do the stuff that AI should be doing.
Sure.
Now, even longer than podcasting, I've been a sci-fi nerd. And the big theme of sci-fi is, when we lose, Matt? We lose when we do the work that the computer should be doing.
Right.
Every sci-fi story is that. And what amazes me is we now can click a button and make all the background noise go away. That only can make our podcast better.
Sure.
We can now click a button and get a first draft of our show notes or the salient points of the podcast. I mean, when this thing comes out on YouTube, the chapter marks are going to be done by AI.
Right.
We can click a button and have that first level of stuff happen. And we can do two things with that. We can cut our time in half, which many should. Many are spending too much money on their podcast. Or we can go one step further because that first step was done by the computers.
Right.
So the AI FUD comes from a lot of different places, but a lot of it is just that simple fact that what is my role in this? And your role in this is the production of content that computers can't make for us.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the word. Some people think of their podcast as art. I certainly wouldn't say that what I'm making is art. Certainly not in the artiste way, maybe in an artist way, but certainly not in an artiste way. But I can see how the people who consider it somewhat, the art that they're, to borrow your phrase, sculpting with their bare hands or their bare vocal cords, it would be impure. Their art would become impure if something, were to get involved. But at the same time, that's not how art ever works, right?
Ever.
Like the thing that stood out to me that at Movement was the idea that we needed a disclaimer if AI was involved. And
I'm going to interrupt you.
yes,
That was a theme, but what was interesting was that was level one of the theme.
Mhm.
If you dug down a little bit in that theme, it was AI is needed. A disclaimer about AI is needed if it's a part that I hold dear. Nobody had
Yes.
problem with AI doing certain things. They just had problems with AI doing other things. And, that kind of stuff really bothers me. Either every element of AI has to be mentioned or no elements of it have to be mentioned. And maybe part of it should be that, but that have to guilty, we're somehow ripping off the world if AI takes out the background noise, we're somehow ripping off the world if we don't tell the world that AI took out the background noise. Just ridiculous.
Yeah, and even if it's more than that, right? Like even the idea that, let's talk about other art, right? So music, or forget music. Start with movies. Do you interrupt the movie to tell people that the special effects were done with CGI?
Exactly. The rock that hits him in the head is not real.
Yeah, and everybody needs to know that.
Right.
Like, let's take a pause and let's make sure the disclaimer is known so that nobody knows we actually shot this movie in outer space. And we were not, in fact, using a warp drive. We were not on the USS Enterprise, just so everybody knows. Some part of consuming art has to involve this, this suspension of disbelief. And so there's something odd about the idea that we can't do that, right? Does it matter that in some song you're listening to on the radio, even though there was a drummer, there was also a kick drum programmed in Pro Tools by somebody? Do we need to do a disclaimer that not all instruments were played by the band? As I say that, on the flip side, I do see people getting all bent out of shape still about live acts using a backing track or auto-tune or something like that. So that's the counter argument, right? Is that people do expect some amount of purity, live realness from certain, music specifically.
I think it's two part. I think right now there are a lot of people who are making a lot of conflict from things that we don't necessarily need to make conflict out of. I think
Right.
there's that. I think that's a subset of some people who, I don't know, dropped as a kid or whatever it is. But the other thing is I think in our search for meaning and in our search for value, we want to know that what we're doing is as real as it can be. And I think what's fascinating is, and that part I agree with, but the real as it can be could be real good use of AI to make the interview better.
Sure.
Could be real good use of Pro Tools. I remember I grabbed a live album from an artist I liked, and it was really funny because in the linear notes they actually said, and by the way, most live albums, they do some enhancement in the studio, and this one wasn't enhanced. And then what was funny was I listened to the live album later. I'm like, yeah, this doesn't sound enhanced. I don't like this as much as I like other
No,
live albums.
no.
So by just spilling the beans, I didn't enjoy this as much.
Yes,
And
yes. The number of live albums without an overdub are almost
yeah,
non-existent.
exactly. And should we
Yeah.
disclose the fact that you and I, even though we're talking to each other, are in two different locations? You
Not
know,
only not only that, this might get edited later.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly. You might not have heard everything.
yeah, you think all the season 1 episodes were only an hour and a half? No, it was 5 hours. We cut those down to an hour and a half just so they'd be nice and small. Um, but yeah, like same thing, right? Editing. Like, what do you mean Seinfeld wasn't all one take?
Right,
Gasp.
right.
So yeah, I don't. So on one hand, and with all due respect to myself and other podcasters, uh, I am putting music and say television and say movies in a different category of art, where uh, those things are the ones where it's like it's okay, right? And then and maybe it's something you mentioned about that podcast didn't have the intermediary, because maybe the theory is the intermediary is the one forcing all these uh, changes to the pure art. Like, I didn't want to do overdubs, but the record company made me do it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
We didn't want to have any special effects, but then Paramount said, well, then nobody will watch your movie, so we had to do CGI. So I don't know if there's something about that no filterness that makes podcasters feel differently, or if, like you said, we just need a boogeyman right now to talk about.
Right. And I think it's a little bit of both. I one of the things that is, it's funny, the thing I love the most about the internet is the thing that I hate the most about the internet. It exists the exact same time in my head. With the internet, it's so easy to do things.
Hmm.
Um, which I love, but as a result of it being so easy to do things, see social media. See the
Yes.
2.5 million podcasts out there, the billions of hours uploaded every what is it second now, to YouTube. One thing grandma taught me: just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Sure.
And just because you can record a 5-hour interview with somebody doesn't mean that you should
Hey
publish all
now.
said 5 hours of it.
Hey now.
Yeah, and, so yeah, so it's just an interesting space, but I think what's important, if I could throw on the podcast consultant hat a little bit into this, is you need to know what it is that you want your podcast to do. A lot of people don't. And if you know what it is that you want your podcast to do, and AI helps you do it, then for the love of, sanity, let AI help you do it.
Can
You
you
know,
can you expand on what people should want their, like, examples of what a podcast should be doing?
well, let's give all sorts of examples. I have one client who he just wants the podcast to make the phone ring.
Hmm.
He sells a service. And basically his podcast is a pre-sale process to his existing client base. Now, talk about no art. It's a 25-minute monologue that would bore, anyone who isn't a potential client of this guy. But he gets less than 500 downloads per episode.
Yeah.
And every time somebody calls, one out of every 3 of them, he converts for a $3,000 package. So every time this podcast, whose job is to make the phone ring, makes the phone ring, the guy makes $1,000.
Right.
Not a bad transaction at all. Not a
Sure.
bad transaction at all. And so he has to make the phone ring, he has to deliver. I heard it said recently, might even have been a podcast movement. Podcast is a transaction. You trade value for attention. You give somebody value in exchange for their attention. So he gives them value on this concept in the financial planning world. He spends
Yeah.
time explaining it, and they go, "Yeah, I like this guy." At the end, he goes, "If we want to go further and talk about this, call this number."
Sure.
It's nice, it's simple, it's easy. That's one example of a podcast. And honestly, I like that kind of podcast a lot more because it's really, really easy. Now a podcast might have to simply appeal to the largest range of people that is humanly possible so that you can get as many downloads as possible so you can sell as many ads as possible. Now these are good because these are what CDNs are for, and the distribution of that type is definitely there. So there's the full range, but other ranges are, there's something when you put a camera in front of yourself and you have a dialogue with someone else about a topic, you just go to conclusions knowing that this is going to be somehow disseminated and distributed to other people. Maybe the purpose of the podcast is just have the conversations that you always knew you should have had but didn't take the time out to do.
Yeah.
A podcast could be quite simply, I remember my when I bought my second house, it was right when the internet real estate was starting to get interesting, and I asked my agent, I'm like, how is the internet affecting your job? She says, "Oh man, the internet's the best thing that ever happened to real estate agents," which isn't something you always heard at the beginning days of real estate agents. And I asked her why. She
Yeah.
said, "Well, in the old days, um, you know, 3 months ago, somebody would say, I want a 3-bedroom house with a pool near the school. And then, they'd have to do all the search. Now, because of the internet, they search, they find, they go, I want to see these 4 houses.
Yeah.
And the commission for the real estate agent was actually the same.
Right.
The internet made her job easier. And if podcasting can do that, it's absolutely fantastic. Now that transaction of service for attention, you got to have something about you to talk about. This episode, hopefully we're talking about kind of some new ways to think about podcasting as we take it in the future years.
Right.
Anybody who's this far along, it's like, yeah, this podcast gets interesting.
Yeah, because now you have me thinking like, uh, on the other hand, going back to his podcast art, with the artiste definition of it, the best art is the art you do that to please yourself, and if other people consume it, so be it. And
Oh, yeah.
usually the second album is way worse because now you've got an audience to please and
Expectations.
expectations, which is like, to like when I thought about starting this, it was just like I want to have conversations that I think are interesting. And if other
Do you remember
people, yeah, go ahead.
Do you remember the Wine Library guys?
Yeah.
My
Gary Vee.
favorite story of podcasting and how it all comes together. They wanted a podcast for one reason: to write off their wine. That was it.
Right.
That was the entire purpose for the podcast.
Yeah.
They bought a big oak table, they bought a bunch of microphones, and now they could record once a month, talk about wine, and write the whole thing off. Now, eventually, they launched a very, very cool, very, very fun business with all sorts of stories that come from that. But yeah, that's what can come from it. So the artistry can start at one place and it can move to another place. But again, I would bet nobody on that team would ever have gone, no, this has to be a pure podcast. No AI for the future of great radio.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's it. Is like if you think of the early days, so like, circa 2005, 2006, when the background on CacheFly and podcasting was, there weren't a whole lot of CDNs to choose from
Right.
back in the day, and the internet was actually a different place in terms of people's connectivity. So like today, you would still say, "Hey, I want a CDN to distribute my podcast because I want people to press play in Australia and have it play immediately." And like that's also changed a little bit as like in the sort of original definition of the podcast, it was your computer syncing things asynchronously so that you could plug in and it would sync to your iPod. And a lot of the traffic that we saw was very flash based, right? Like you publish and then you get a gazillion iTunes clients, and that inrush of traffic is what caused a lot of people problems in the early podcast days. And I remember the Apple Store, Scott and Pete, when they were running the podcast section of the Apple Store, they would call people and say like, "Hey, we're going to feature you, as you said, on the page,
Right.
in 3 weeks. What do you guys do for hosting?"
Right.
Because what's going to happen when you're on the page is you're going to get a whole bunch of downloads all at once. And they would say, well, if you don't have something, you should call CacheFly. And so that's where we got a lot of those original Like at one point, I think we had 6 of the 10 top podcasts when there were really only 10 top podcasts, not 2.5 million. Just because it was about that inrush of traffic. And today, I don't know the stats comparatively, compared to almost 20 years ago, but there's a lot more asynchronous. Or sorry, there's a lot less asynchronous, a lot more, I'm going to press play now, and now my mobile device is going to download it on the fly over the cell network. And is it playing? Can I hear it yet? Nope. Okay, let me switch to the next one. So the attention span
Yeah.
of people pressing play has changed.
Have you followed the Overcast situation?
The what situation?
Overcast?
I'm familiar, but I wouldn't say I shouldn't weigh in, is what I would say.
Yeah. So Marco, who is brilliant, the guy is just amazing. Marco did an upgrade to Overcast recently. And one of the things that Marco saw, his mind works a little bit differently than the rest of us. But one of the things that Marco saw was the streaming analogy could result in some buffering chaos that people didn't necessarily care about.
Yeah.
So he launches the new version of Overcast, and Overcast would have to download the show first before it would play. And for many people, it's 5-6 seconds, and you'd even see the little indicator go as it downloaded the thing.
Yeah.
That lasted about a week and a half. People wanted that click play, start podcast now. They wanted that instantaneous thing. And even good stewardship of bandwidth and experience management simply didn't work. And so, he instantly moved it.
Yeah. Well, and expectations have changed.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think is the story there, right? Is users have moved their expectations from how they would consume a podcast. And, also circa 2005, 2006, there was, no mobile phones really where people were listening to podcasts on. The mobile network certainly didn't have enough capacity. There was no LTE yet. Like we were in the way back days of bandwidths. So also the difference between, a good experience and a bad experience then was it does not work.
Right.
Right? Like it's not like, it buffered once in an hour and 20 minutes and that was really annoying. It was like, I can't download this thing. I'm moving on with my life.
Yeah.
And today it's not working means it did buffer for 10 seconds once in an hour and a half and wasn't that really annoying. So that's sort of the evolution of expectations as well, is like in 2005 you needed a CDN because it didn't work without a CDN. Or the difference between a good and a bad CDN experience was that it didn't work. Today, it's to your point, in a more ideal world, it's like, we use CloudFront and it took 8 seconds to download the whole 2 hours. Not like CacheFly where it took 6 seconds to download the whole 2 hours. It's like a distinction without a difference today sometimes when you look at the best case scenarios, right? But ultimately with CDNs and most services in general, it's not about the 10th percentile, it's about the 99th percentile and how many viewers that are in emerging markets that have really crappy bandwidth, but are still really interested in your message. How can they get it? Like it's really realistically, what I'm trying to say is it's really easy to serve a podcast today in Dallas, Texas.
Right.
Almost regardless of what technology, CDN, whatever you're using. Like somebody's got to be having a really bad day for a user in Dallas to be like, oh my God, this podcast doesn't make me happy.
Yeah.
But less so in Mumbai.
Right.
And less so in, Nairobi. And still due to the infrastructure is a little more advanced, but oceans and time, still less so in Perth. So just based on where most people's infrastructure tends to live. So it is still the stakes are different, right? And it's like good, bad, annoying versus like totally broken, were the old stakes. Now it's more like, are people going to move on to something else? And that's really I think the challenge most people have, whether it's podcasts or not, is like, if you're a podcaster, like you said, you're trading time for attention, or sorry, money for attention, right? Or time for attention.
Value for attention.
But what that means is you're in an attention war. And the perception you would have is that you are an attention, you're fighting against other podcasts for people's podcast attention. But that's not really how attention works.
Yes.
You are fighting against YouTube. You're fighting against Instagram. You're fighting against this one quick hack to, make dinner faster. You are fighting against a text message. You are fighting against somebody launching a game. You're fighting against somebody putting their phone down and turning Netflix on. Like we have a customer in the gaming space, and I mean, this was years ago, but I remember we were talking about competition and what their metrics were that mattered internally to them. And their answer was the game needs to launch just on a phone. The game needs to launch just as fast as a YouTube video, because it had nothing to do with any other games. They didn't see themselves competing with other gaming companies. They thought their number one competition was YouTube, because hey, if the game doesn't load, what are they going to do? And the answer was click on whatever the weirdest, message they received while they're waiting for it. And now they don't end up in the game. Now they're down the YouTube rabbit hole. So I think that's the hard part about how prolific the amount of content you can reach on your phone in 3 flicks of a thumb and 1.5 seconds is there's so much you could do with your time. Sitting there waiting for the podcast to start is like kind of high risk if you're if that's your show, because there's a lot of stuff that's just like oop deep doop doop that, and they'll never get back to your show, right? People are gonna move on, even from a bad experience, right? Like, it's different than it totally doesn't work, but it's like, oh, buffering, let me do something that doesn't buffer because I can, right? And that's back to your, like, the power of the internet is you can do anything from your phone right now. And wait around for this show to load, not that high on most people's list of stuff they want to be doing.
Yeah. In the early days of podcasting, when I speak from the stage and do presentations, I could always get the audience by the following, I would always say, in order to be successful in podcasting, all you have to do is be better than drive time radio.
Mm.
And then I'd ask the audience, who thinks they're better than drive time radio? And like everybody in the audience would, anybody can be better than drive time radio. Yeah, the competition used to be not as much, and then the guys from Anchor, now Spotify for podcasting, they came in with their premise of, we're going to do for podcasting what YouTube did for online video. We're going to make it free. We're going to make it instant. We've got 1.5 million podcasts of, tap, 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 is this thing on? Thanks for listening to episode 1. Episode 2 is going to be great. Thanks, Mom. To now, anybody can load a podcast. And it's popular discourse now. One of the most popular shows on TV. Murders in the Building is about a podcast. So yeah, there's a lot more noise, but I think the noise thing, if you sort through it, becomes really, really interesting. There are some amazing, I love Italian food, man. I love Italian food. I grew up in Europe. My family, we would summer in Italy. That's a whole nother story. And there are some amazing Italian restaurants in New York, and you can just the best food just there. But, I live in Portland, and I just can't, those restaurants in New York are not competition. Because they're not
Right.
where I'm at. They're not what I'm doing. No matter how good they are, no matter how much better they are, no matter what awards they won or whatnot, they're just not competition right now.
Sure.
My competition is, what I got nearby me and near local. I've had podcasters who, professionals who would think it was the greatest month of their lives if 100 people showed up to their Chamber of Commerce presentation.
Mm.
But they got less than 1,000 downloads for their podcast.
Right.
And yeah, it just, the whole perspective, the whole process is just really interesting. And I think that point about the expectation of, I'm going to click play and it's going to work, that has to happen. And I think the value there, if there's a chance that your show doesn't go when somebody clicks play, is that something you should be spending some money on?
Right. I mean, or to more succinctly, that's not better than drive time radio.
Right.
Right. One of the best parts about drive time radio is I turn my radio on and I'm done.
Yeah.
And I mean, I like that I like that litmus test. In your eyes, out of 2.5 million shows, for the right audience, are they all better than drive time radio, or can you have? Is there a way to make a podcast so bad that even to your ideal audience, it's not better than drive time radio?
Well, that's a yeah, that's one for a few beers.
Without
I would
no
say the
names,
biggest.
no names.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The competition, yeah, it'd be very hard to make something worse than the drive time radio. However, your competition could probably make something better, quicker, faster. So what's the old joke? The two guys are walking in the forest, and they hear a bear coming, and the one guy sits down and takes off his hiking boots and puts on his sneakers. And the guy goes, "Dude, you can't outrun a bear." He goes, "No, I don't need to outrun a bear. I just need to outrun you."
Yeah.
And so the whole process here is just simply, can you be better than drive time radio and attractive to your audience where they happen to be?
Mm. And where is that audience today? Like in your mind, you know, is podcasting reaching today 30% of most people's audiences? Are there some people where 100% of the people they're trying to reach really do listen to podcasts on a
Well,
frequent enough basis?
yeah, it's interesting numbers, and it has to be monitored a different way. You know, it's sort of like, what percentage of Sony television sets are watching your TV show?
Mm,
Like, no, TV shows made for all the TV stations. One of the big debates at Podcast Movement was, is it really a podcast if it's on YouTube?
mm,
And the technical specifications. I mean, this audience is nerdy enough. They know that YouTube doesn't work with RSS feeds, with XML, yeah, attachment schemas and all that good stuff. But the fact of the matter is, a show, is the competition Seth Meyers, or is the competition your competition, and how do the numbers reflect? If Leo Laporte, let's chat about Leo. Leo, I loved the beginning of podcasting with the way Leo so completely embraced it. And the guy from Tech TV moved to the show that he always wanted to do, and
yeah.
it was a ton of fun. And then he had this show, This Week in Tech, where nerds would talk about tech for 2.5 hours.
Yep.
And because the tech nerds that would talk about tech for 2.5 hours were on this podcasting thing, Leo just instantly got his entire market, got his entire audience, in year one. And I think you guys were the CDN for that, right?
Still
Remember
are.
right?
Still are.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
And then what was funny was Leo would go, well, podcast isn't growing. No, actually, Leo, podcast is growing great. It's just you have the entirety of the audience. You grab them so quickly. You
Yeah.
grab them so well. You grab them so intelligently that there's nothing left. If a teacher for a school, has 30 students listening to her podcast of her classroom, there's not 40 student. Well, these days with school overpowering, that's another thing. But
Yeah.
it just depends who your audience is, and it depends who those numbers are.
Sure.
The market isn't I have a podcast.
Mm,
The marketing isn't I have a podcast. The marketing is you can now grab me on your terms. You call 2 accounting agencies and you say, "Hey, last year's taxes were crazy. I need somebody to give me a second thought." And the first person says, "Come on in with your box of receipts."
yeah.
And then the second person says, "You can come Thursday and please fill out these 10 intake forms. And if you're there, if you're not there by 10, we're going to cancel you and keep your deposit," or whatever it was. You're going to go with that first person, even if that first person isn't necessarily as good. So the
Well,
message
yeah.
isn't that you have a podcast. The message is that you can grab this anytime, any place, anywhere.
Well, I think that's business advice that people also don't pay enough attention to, which in my mind that transcends podcasting, because I've had that conversation with a lot of people over time. Is like, it doesn't matter who the best dry cleaner in Portland is. What matters is who is the one who picked up the phone when you realized you needed dry cleaning done.
Right.
Because nobody is doing research to identify who the best dry cleaner is, and then they're gonna, cross compare. They're gonna, send samples to each of them, and then see what comes back cleanest. And there's this perception that if you're a dry cleaner, you might have certainly in tech, your perception is that that's how people shop, right? I need the best dry cleaning. And the reality is people need the most convenient dry cleaning. And convenience starts with, who did I call that said bring it in right now? And almost everything else is irrelevant. What
Yeah, yeah,
technology you use, whether it's
yeah.
green, like almost none of that actually shows up
Yeah.
when people are trying to solve a problem. Right? And like
Be-
the other example for that too is like, again, just on the random business tangent, is people's problems change day to day. And the podcast that wasn't interesting last week could be very interesting this week, in the same way that you had 3 door-to-door air conditioning, HVAC people that came to your house and you said, I'm not interested. Then the 4th guy showed up after your air conditioner broke. All of a sudden, you were extremely interested in learning more about air conditioning services.
Yeah.
But are the first 3 better? Is it worth doing research? No, you're probably gonna, go with the guy who happened, or girl, who happened to knock on your door the day your air conditioning broke down. Because it's an immediate solution to a problem that you really don't care that much about. But I want to re-ask my audience question in a different way, because I think it's interesting, and I don't know the answer. Let's say that I do want to reach all the Italian restaurant connoisseurs in Portland, because that's my thing. I also love Italian food, and it's really important to me that I get my message out to everybody else who loves it. If I say, and my medium for distributing that love I have is going to be a podcast. Just in general today, what percentage of Italian restaurant diners do I have the opportunity to reach by starting my podcast? Am I hitting 20%? Like, let's say, adults 18 to 65. Like how much of my market can I address broadly?
Are you addressing them broadly in audience consumption of said podcast, or awareness that the podcast is there when you need it?
I mean, probably awareness. I don't imagine. I imagine the time I'm most interested in that podcast is when I'm hungry and thinking about going out for Italian.
Yeah. See, Portland has an extremely popular food blog called Eater.
Mm-hmm.
And Eater is about, eating. And it seems to be predominantly about our food cart scene. And it's a lot of fun. And I go there on a regular basis, as do a lot of enthusiasts of special cuisines.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably 3 or 4 places online that you could grab probably 85% of the Portland Italian restaurant scene.
Yeah.
Eater, probably 1190 KEX, and a couple other places. You could put ads for the podcast on these places. Now, you got to be smart. It's got to be something called, the Portland Italian Show, or Pasta Portland, or something like that. You got to let people know what it is.
Yeah.
Once that happens, then when somebody has time, and personally, I would have an ad for Pasta Portland, and then in parentheses have a joke with it. At least it's better than drive time radio. And now when somebody gets up in the, because our traffic ain't good, now somebody gets up in the morning, they're like, okay, I can listen to drive time, or I can kick in that Portland Italian podcast. And here's the great thing. Only the people who care about Italian food and listen to podcasts are the ones who are going to listen to that. So we can go deep.
Right.
Your show, not everybody on the planet needs a CDN.
No, almost nobody on the planet needs a CDN.
Exactly.
I'm acutely aware of that fact on a daily basis when I look at our sales numbers.
Right. So, but the thing is, people who need a CDN go deep.
Right.
And those who go deep, if they find out that you've got a show where you go deep with thought leaders, I mean, A, that reinforces your theme. B, this podcast season that we're doing here might be consumed in 3 years.
Right.
When we're podcasting holograms, and they want to see what Matt and the kooky people he met, what they came up with. So it's very possible. But the message is not Portland's hot new Italian food podcast with a press release sent to the 6 o'clock news.
Mm-hmm.
The message is to where the Italian food eaters, the online connected Italian food eaters in Portland go, that there's a show that goes deep into what it is that we're doing.
Right.
I would suggest that the person who does that show tries to get an article at Eater. Maybe does a switch out with Eater and says, hey guys, we'll do an ad for Eater for the next 3 months in exchange for, an ad for 1 month on you guys or something like that.
Yeah.
But an Italian food, I'll tell you this, now you're making me hungry. If I saw anywhere online an ad for a Portland Italian food scene podcast,
Yep.
I would listen.
Right.
But I'll tell you this, now maybe after this that might change. In my 20 years of this, I've never gotten up in the morning, opened up iTunes, and went to see if there were any Portland Italian podcasts, Italian food podcasts.
Right.
And that's the difference. And we tell everybody, a podcast without marketing is like a billboard in the basement.
Mm. Yep.
So it's there, and everybody's connected. Everybody has a cell phone, right, or smartphone. Right now, it's funny. If you look at the smartphone numbers, it's funny. I remember the day when half of Americans had a smartphone, and then it was 75% of Americans have a smartphone. And now it's like 96, 97. And though that 3% is not people who can't afford smartphones.
Right.
Those are the people who have gone dumb phone because it's cool now. They're the ones who listen to vinyl records and
Yeah.
wear hemp clothing and that kind of thing. And so anybody with any desire to be connected is connected now, and so they can get a podcast. And the thing is, they don't have to have the YouTube app installed. They don't have to have the iHeartRadio app installed. They don't have to have anything installed. The default apps on their phone can get them to that. All they need to know is that exists.
Right. And so is discovery. So
discoverability is huge.
Yeah, and that's probably the area that there's no solution for. It's just the nature of the beast. But I would say almost everything about podcasting has gotten better over the decades, except for that, probably.
Yeah, I think part of that's a perception thing. You and I were in this early enough. Remember, pre-Google. Yes, kids, there was a pre-Google time. You could come up in the top of the search engine by putting any keyword you wanted to in your site. So, there were Portland restaurants who would, put Britney Spears in their meta tags, hoping that people, when they're searching for Britney Spears, would come across their Italian restaurant and somehow decide they're the perfect place to get cannelloni.
Right.
It's not going to happen. And so discoverability actually came to the point to where, now discoverability is, be found by the people who are actually looking for you.
Right.
And niche down. And I think podcasting is going to go the same way. I think the problem with podcasting, and one of these days I'm going to frame it, there was, the early days of podcasting were fun. There was someone who stood from stage and said, podcast your passion and the profits will follow. And there were t-shirts made and that kind of stuff. And yeah, it didn't work.
Yeah.
It didn't work. And so I think it'll get better, but I think expectations of it will change. I think it'll be closer to people to realizing that, man, if I can reach 500 people with this show by recording in 1 hour, that is so much better than anything else I could possibly do.
Right.
That once that mindset changes, I think the discoverability issue is going to go away. Now, there are people who think, there are people who think they're absolutely brilliant. And they're absolutely fascinating. And people, the fact that there aren't as many people listening to their shows or listening to Joe Rogan proves that there's something wrong with the discoverability issue.
Yeah.
That's not the case. That's just the issue of class.
Sure. There has to be something in there where, like, I always try and draw the analogies to other stuff, right? Like, if your expectation is that you're going to be an indie artist, but also sell as many records as, somebody who's on a major label.
Right. Right.
It happens,
right?
0.00001% of the time, right? Like, just because you put a song on SoundCloud doesn't mean you're gonna hit the top 10 on the Billboard charts. And I think that's okay, right? Like, again, drawing the art analogy, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of various productions of My Fair Lady going on right now around the world, and not all of those people are going to end up being Hollywood actors, even if they're better at actually acting than, insert your favorite or least favorite Hollywood actor here. Like, to me, that's also a discoverability thing, right? Like, subjective stuff like that, it's success is still subjective, right? Like, I don't think there's anybody better than LeBron James at basketball who is undiscovered. Right? Like, there's nobody who's like, just because sports specifically, generally speaking, are meritocracies. There's outliers if people are real personality problems, but usually they get to the league, whatever that league is, the NFL, Major League Baseball, basketball, and then they get thrown out because they're too hard to work with or something. But if you're actually really good at basketball, you will make it. If you're actually really good at golf, you will make it. If you're actually really good at baseball, you will make it. If you're actually really good at acting, doesn't really matter. If you're actually really good at talking on camera, doesn't really matter. If you're actually really good at playing music, doesn't really matter. They're not really meritocracies. There's a whole lot of right place, right time, got lucky, got a break. Right? Like, the best guitar player on earth might not be Eddie Van Halen. It might be some guy in Sandusky, Ohio, who plays in his basement. We'll never know. But I would say, nor should we. Right? Like, that's part of the discoverability challenge, is like, nor should we. Those things aren't meritocracies. Those things are simply based on, did you get the right thing at the right time? Right? There's 10,000 ways Joe Rogan would end up having 500 subscribers still. But he didn't. Right? And abundance mindset is, so that means I can too, as opposed to well, that says there's something wrong with discoverability if I also don't have, 20
Right,
million
exactly,
people watching.
exactly. Yeah, it's not discoverability's problem, it's reality's problem.
Yeah. Like,
And if you have a problem with reality,
Italian restaurants, just because
Yeah.
you have a really good Italian restaurant doesn't mean you're going to be on Pasta Portland.
exactly.
Right? You're going to be
And
somewhere
I
that
don't
they don't
doubt,
cover.
and what's funny isn't the right word. I love a good marinara, I just the purity, the essence of the marinara is just that and a good cup of coffee, and Paul's good with life,
Yeah.
And
Not at the same time,
I
I assume.
no, not at the same time. I have no doubt that the best marinara on the planet is made by some grandma somewhere, who
You're
makes
never
it
going to
for
you're never going to taste it.
but I'm glad there's a place down the street that also makes it that I can eat from, and
Right.
and so that's the thing we have to work out. But this idea that this meritocracy, podcasting is not an industry of meritocracy,
Right.
and it never will be. And if you're looking for it to be, good luck. You've got a better chance of going elsewhere. But there are a lot of industries that are not industries of meritocracy, and that's okay. As much as we love food trucks, and Portland, we love our food trucks. The food truck that's at the game that you're at right now is the one that you're buying the burrito from.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's a First Amendment issue, right? You can say whatever you want. There's nothing that says I have to listen.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Like, there's just the perception that an audience will, to your point about the original quote, the perception that if you put out good content, an audience will find it, is nonsense across all possible spectrums.
Yes.
You need promotion, you need marketing. That's just everything 101 is like, if nobody knows about it, it's unlikely they will consume it. But is that a again, is it even a problem, or is this just about managing people's expectations?
It's all about managing expectations. It's not a problem, and if anything, it's a relief. The one thing I have to tell all my clients is, you will get an email from someone who's claiming that your audio is terrible. You will get an email from somebody telling you that your video has been framed terribly. You're going to get a review from somebody who says, your sound levels were off. Well, here's the thing. A, they're coming automatically. B, they're not your client.
Mm.
And the cool thing is, if you don't have to have perfect sound levels, if you don't have to have perfect framing, if you don't have to have these things, I mean, be as good as you can, obviously. But if it's not perfect to pass the audio snobs thing, but you're still reaching your audience.
Right.
Joe Polish, I Love Marketing. There's an episode of I Love Marketing that is painful audio. It's painful audio. Joe is on, I believe, I even think it was an analog cell phone. He's calling into a bridge line. I think he's in a
Yeah.
tunnel in New York somewhere. I mean, it's just absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
His co-host, Dean, is on a digital phone, at least, on his home phone line, and they're connected with the bridge line with Tony Robbins, who is in Fiji, bragging about how far away he is from his home, yet still getting a Wi-Fi connection for the Skype call that is making the podcast.
Yeah.
So Tony's in and out, Joe's in and out, it's painful audio, but it's Tony Robbins off book.
Right.
And if anybody knows anything about Tony Robbins spends 99.99999% of his life on book. That's why he does what he does. And to get Tony Robbins off book is absolutely amazing. So that episode has been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times, and it's painful.
Yeah.
But the expectation is not that it was going to sound great. The expectation is there are people listening to this who will go dig that thing up because they got Tony Robbins off book,
Right.
not because the audio was great.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's all about expectations, but it's expectations on both sides. Does it make the phone ring? That's the only question you'd ask about the show.
Right.
Does it associate you with the people you want to be associated with? That's the only thing you need to ask about the show. Not, is it getting some of them Joe Rogan numbers?
Right. And say more about the idea that this goes back to what you said originally, right? Like, what is it there to do? Right. And the to do is make the phone. If the to do is make the phone ring, and the phone's not ringing, how hard is it to stay with it?
Well, great question, but I'd ask a different question. If the purpose of the show is to make the phone ring and the phone ain't ringing, why are you doing the show?
Fair point. I mean,
now, can we look at some basic things? Now, the great thing is in podcasting, we have one of the top, and one of these days I'm going to ask him for permission to use his name. One of the top YouTube people in the world. This is a guy, one of the top. I showed him the stats we have for podcasting. And he looks at me and he says, there's really no difference between the stats that you have and the stats we have at YouTube, is there? And I said, no, not in the core stuff. The thing is, if your job, well, let's make the phone ring because it's an easy one. If your job is to make the phone ring,
Yep.
Why would the phone ring? The phone's going to ring because they want more. One of the things we can track is how far they listened. If you have a 2-hour-long show and they hang up in 15 minutes, you might not have even gotten the phone number out at that point in the show anyway. But if it's a 2-hour show and they only listen to 15 minutes, if we've learned anything, it's that they don't want more from you.
Right.
They want less from you. And so it doesn't matter how many downloads you get. It matters how far they have listened to what it is that you're doing. If you're, I had a client, really interesting project. He's a financial planner who wanted local people to listen to his show to come in. Like he's the type of financial planner who loves to bring the gift to the kid's graduation. Real hands-on, that type of guy. Great radio background, great video background, produced a stellar show, great results, people listening all the way to the end. It was what we wanted. People loved it. But at the end of the year, when people called his office and they asked, how do you hear about us? Nobody said the podcast. So in all means, the show was successful, but we weren't getting that, I want to sign up because that particular region of the country was a very, very niche, very specific region of the country. And so, what's neat about what do you want the show to do? So we asked 4 questions, really simple, easy, and nothing magic here. What do you want the show to do? How will you know the show's doing it?
Yep.
And so what's great is when you want the show to do, make the phone ring.
Yep.
Okay. how do you know the show's doing it? When we did that with the guy, I asked him, I said, hey, phone rings, I mean, the guy's got a sales machine. Phone rings, are you going to find out why they called? Well, yeah, no, they called to buy. Well, no, you're going to find out like what the source was. No, my guys are, they sell. So you're not going to ask. No. So now we don't know how many times the phone rang as a result of the show.
Yeah.
You know what we did? Send him a cell phone, put it on my account.
Yeah.
Sent him a cell phone, said, give this to your best sales guy. Every time the cell phone rings, it's the podcast.
Yeah.
Easy. And Gray picks the phone. Hey, thanks for calling. What'd you think about the latest episode?
Yeah.
Instant Got Rapport. They're converting 1 out of every 3 on that phone. They're converting 1 out of every 10 on the other phone, only because we tracked it.
Right.
Now his consumption, this guy's amazing. Every month when we get the reporting, I'm like, well, we give everybody what was their most downloaded, their least downloaded, their most consumed, their least consumed. It's part of the report.
Yeah.
And always tell them, well, your most consumed was 105% because people were clicking rewind and listening to parts again. Your least consumed was only 97%,
Right.
or something like that. And so the process, what do you want the show to do? How do you know that it's doing it? And the thing is, a lot of people are like, I want to impact the market for this. I want to become the number 1 Italian food podcast in Portland. Great. How will you know that you are that?
Right.
And if you don't have a way to do that, don't record anything yet. We got to figure that out. So what do you want it to do? How do we know that it's doing it? Then number 3, ready for this? Is it doing it?
Right.
And is it doing it? In the case of the phone call, it's absolutely doing it. In the case of we talked earlier, what if it isn't ringing? Well, let's look at why. And it's really easy to tell. If it's a 2-hour show and people are hanging up 15 minutes in, we know why they're not calling.
Right.
And the cool thing is maybe it's just edit the thing down to 15 minutes.
Right.
I'll give you a clue. I'll give you a tip. One thing we have found, and please hear me on this if you're considering this, it is not chopping up your 2-hour show into 8-minute or into 8 episodes. Like it's not the interview with Paul part 1, the interview with Paul part 2, the interview with Paul part 3. It's people want this segment in 15-minute chunks.
Right.
That's what they want. And so when you go through that process, it becomes really, really interesting. And then at that point, if a client's worth, well, let's use the math for this one because it's easy. Client's worth $3,000. They convert 1 out of every 3 phone calls. To make the phone ring now is worth $1,000.
Yep.
Now you got the marketing budget for the show. Now it's
Sure.
really easy. Outlier case, results may vary. It's not what's going to happen on your show, but it's an easy one.
Yeah.
But if you have, a membership program that's $25,000 a year, you bring 1 person in a year, you probably paid for your podcast 2, and you paid for an amazing one.
Yeah.
But it's so much better than I want to get some of that sweet, sweet mattress money, or Green Chef that's going to sponsor my show or something like that.
Yeah.
On this model works better. So what do you want it to do? Is it doing it? Or how do we know that it's doing it? Is it doing it? And then how do we do it better?
Yeah.
And how do we do it better for some might be shut down the show?
Right. There has to be some math where it takes N number of touches before a customer will pick up the phone and call you, right? So going back to our, the dry cleaning analogy, I love dry cleaners. I love listening about dry cleaning stories on the podcast. If I don't have any dry cleaning to do right now, I'm probably not going to call.
Right.
But in 2.5 months, when I go to that wedding or I go, spill something on that thing, now I need a dry cleaner. Ooh, I know who I'm going to call. I know who my first thought is. The host of Dry Cleaner Confidential. There has to be a lag element where I guess what I'm saying is everything looks terrible in the middle. And there has to be some sort of art of figuring out if you're in the middle. Like I've heard people, nobody of consequence, but I've heard people say something like, you don't know if you have a good podcast until you've recorded 100 episodes. And that might be true to know if it's good. I think that's different than is it doing what you want it to do. But there has to be something where the sample size, either in terms of time or amount of content produced, to dial in those things. Like what does hit with people? What are those segments that people go back and listen to again? Like at some point you just need to produce with your blindfold on, I would think, and just go, I'm going to keep going because I don't know yet. How do you coach people through either A, that feeling, or then B, knowing when we've reached yet?
Statistically speaking, it's really hard to know the totality of it all with, your true numbers until you get about 1,000 downloads per episode.
Mm.
So that's one number there. There is definitely a gut feeling at play here. You and I, when we stop recording this, we'll know how we feel about it.
Yeah.
And everybody should do that. But that combination needs to be intermixed with the reality of what's happening. Let's say you only get 10 downloads.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, if you only get 10 downloads, they're probably your friends. So if there was ever a time to look at the 10 downloads and see how far people consumed, it was in that first 10.
Yeah.
Because that's really, because your friend, oh man, your show is great. I loved it. And nobody listened more than 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That's lip service. So the sooner you look at the numbers, the better off you are to go. But when you get 100 downloads or 100 listens, and by the way, downloads and listens are two different things. We can chat about that.
Yeah.
But if you get 100 listens and you have a call to action that is multi-step, usually the call to action is call a number or visit a website or email an email address or scan a QR code or something like that. If you've got 100 and nobody took that first step,
Mm.
you got to ask yourself why. And it's the same thing as let's go back to Italian food. The pizza restaurant is giving everybody a little tiny slice with a coupon. And that coupon code is good for a free pizza. So they hand away 100 of these coupon codes. Nobody comes back with the coupon code to the restaurant.
Yeah.
That means that your pizza was not that good.
Right.
Not that coupons don't work. And so with 100 of any episode, you can get a pretty decent call on how it's going.
Right.
Now, you can't really see it. Oh yeah, the whole inverse thing. Dan Sullivan and Joe Polish, 10X Talk. That was the first profitable podcast we worked on 3 years ago. 3 years ago, and the podcast is still going. I sent Dan and Joe episode 1 on vinyl because it was their 10th anniversary and because everything sounds better on vinyl.
Yeah.
They had no idea what they were doing at the beginning of all this, and when Joe went on his famous sabbatical, we took about the first 20 episodes of 10X Talk and we cut them down. We moved them from the hour and a half to the 20 minutes, and those went really well and we learned it. So it's, are you pointed in the right direction?
Mm.
The things that are not the right direction. Number 1, reviews. Mom will leave you a review. You can buy reviews. Your friends are going to suck up for reviews. One person we dealt with, it was really funny. They had a review contest because they thought reviews were important. And they promised for one out of every, it was 100 reviews or something, they'd give away an iPad. You know who likes iPads, Matt? Everybody.
Yeah. People who aren't really interested in your show.
Exactly. So you know what they got? They got 10 times as many reviews at Apple as they got downloads of the podcast episode.
Yep.
Apple tracked that one. And so the good reviews are solid. You can buy those, you can make those up yourself. It's, there's a lot of ways to do that. You got to look at that consumption. Now let's talk about the downloads versus the consumption. Client says, yeah, we're getting 1 million downloads per episode. No, you're not. Yes, we are. No, you're not. Yes, we are. Look at the stats. And the stats showed 1 million downloads. Now, 999,000 and change of those downloads were coming from Bangladesh.
Right.
And I said, Bangladesh? He goes, oh, yeah, it's this conservative radio network that is worried about being censored by the deep state. So, they're serving everything out of Bangladesh. I'm like, yeah, that's not the way podcasting works. Because the fact of the matter is, the tracking is the downloads. So it's 999,000 and change Bangladeshi downloads. And that doesn't exist for your show, which means they're Bangladeshi robot downloads, which, by the way, was my favorite band in college.
Yes.
And that's not real. So you look at the numbers, you look at the consumption, you look at the calls to action if that first step's taken. Now, there's a long difference between someone clicking on a QR code, visiting a website, emailing for a coupon, that kind of thing. That's that first step that you got to look at, but you got to look at it early.
Yeah.
Because if there's 100 and nobody takes action, there's probably a reason why.
Sure. Is
So, 1,000 is where your stats are really good.
Yeah,
100 is where you can start to see trends, but that consumption element is where it gets really, really interesting.
yeah. And most realistically, most marketing spend in the world today is on stuff that can't be tracked.
Right.
Um, so I get like twofold question, right? Number one, um, is that really a blessing or a curse for podcasts that can be tracked? And number two, um, what if you're trying to do something along those like the way I'm going to measure if my podcast is successful is if at retail we sell 1.5 more widgets per Walmart. Like it start with the first question, right? Like is it actually better in a world where everything else people are throwing money at is like, oh, you know, we just won't know if that national TV ad worked until 6 months from now.
Um, great question. Um, I I believe it is a curse for at least businesses like mine because we're really interested in the tracking and we're interested in implementation of it.
Yeah,
50% of the calls I get, starts with some version of, "Paul, I need more downloads." "But
right.
great. How many you want? I can buy them from China. They're cheap." And the answer, no, that's not what I want. Oh, what is it that you want? So it's bad news for me. It's good news for anybody who's got a budget they got to spend by the end of the year. And they don't necessarily need to recount for it.
Yeah.
Early days of blogging, I was reading this article about this guy who he was going from town to town around the country, and he was having blogger beer night, where he'd invite all the bloggers in town to free beer, and he'd buy them all free beer in hope that the product that he was working with would get press. And I'm like, oh, this is fascinating. So I looked up the guy's website, and you know what was happening? He was in Portland that day. That day for Beer and Blog Night. I am so there. So I'm at Beer and Blog Night. I watch everything happen. The guy is spinning like crazy. He's buying the potato spuds. He's buying everything. Big bill. I wait. Had enough. Enjoyed the beer, but didn't have so much that I couldn't have a good conversation when this is over. Waited till everybody left, and I asked him. I said, "Hey, no shade, no lemonade, no worries. I just want to know. At some point, the accounting team is going to say, prove to us that this was worth it. What's your metric? What's your analytic? How are you tracking this? And he looks at me straight in the eyes and he says, oh, yeah, I'll be out of a job by then. You know,
There you go.
like
Well,
at least you were being honest.
yeah, because
People come, Paul, I don't want to spend more than $500 a month on my podcast because I don't know if it makes any money. Yeah, well,
right,
$500 a month podcast isn't going to make you any money. So, I can make you no money for less than $500 a month.
right,
But what do you want to do? So it's hard for me, but in the grand sales scheme of things, you can buy punch cards. I had a guy called. He said, Paul, I appreciate everything you said, but I bought a punch card for my first 100 podcasts. Bought a punch card for his first 100 podcasts.
yeah,
That's a good word. Yeah. We're not going to see any results.
yeah. Because like,
And then the first question was, is it good or bad? It's bad for me, good for people who want to spend without, to make it easy. And then what was the second question?
second question is, uh, if that's what you actually want, right? Like there is no immediate call to action. Um, what I want is to sell 1.5 more units per Walmart. Um, is podcasting in a world where I'm not looking for immediate trackable results? Is it as good a medium for those types of buys as a billboard or a traditional media buy?
I mean, I think don't have any numbers to prove this. If somebody, but let's say somebody called and asked our office, we want 1.5 more rigids. What we'd actually do is, and we've started the process. Nobody's wanted to spend the money because it's not cheap. But we would work on a podcaster reach out campaign because the thing that's interesting about podcasters is the ones that people stick with. People come for the content, they stay for the voice.
Mm,
People came to Rogan because they wanted to hear from person X, and then they go, man, I really like the way Joe Rogan talks about things, or they go to Joe Polish, because they want to learn about this, but I really like the way Joe does, so people come for the content, they stay for the voice. That voice is extremely viable and valuable to people that get a lot.
Right.
There's a show that I love that, didn't have the t-shirt, didn't have the ads, didn't have everything. One day, all of a sudden, they got the mattress campaign. So Heidi and I bought a $1,200 mattress, which I'm sure they got like a $25 commission out of,
Yeah.
or something like that. But I just wanted to show my heart to the show. So I think in a needle moving thing, if you could get 50 podcasters to talk about product X, that I think would move the needle. And then, of course, does product X deserve a show? If you're selling supplements,
Yeah.
a show about supplements pretty boring. But
Right.
50 podcasters who took the supplements and felt like a king afterwards, pretty exciting.
Right.
And then the other number I forgot was I believe in 8 touches. I believe it's not real until they've heard about it 8 times.
Yeah.
And one of the things I realized back in the early days, Amazon, for the longest time, I went to school at UC Santa Barbara, which has Magellan's, which is this big travel store. And so for the longest time, I just assumed that Amazon was a travel bookstore, was an online travel bookstore. I just assumed that.
Yeah.
I realized Amazon sold everything late in the game. But then I realized, Amazon has that affiliate program where if you sell the book, you get 3% or whatever it is. And that rule of eights, this is what's amazing with Amazon. So somebody's researching a book. They go to website 1, they read the review. They go to website 2, they read the review. They go to website 3, they read the review. They wait a week, they hear about it again. They go to 4, 5, and 6. But all 8 of those websites had the Amazon affiliate link in common with them.
Right.
I call that the Isyot effect. I call that Isyot, ISYOT. The Isyot effect stands for I've seen you out there.
Right.
And when you see that book reviewed by 8 different people, when you have that supplement reviewed by 10 different podcasters, that type of thing. But that allegiance to podcasters is really funny. I had a gal listen to my podcast. She came up at an event and she said, Paul, I love your show. Are you going to talk about X? Nope. Are you going to talk about Y? Nope. Are you going to talk about Z? Nope. What are you going to talk about? I told her A. She said, okay, well, I know about X, Y, and Z because your show anyway. She was already pre-sold.
Right.
And she bought the product I was selling at that event. So if it was a move the needle on a national scale, I'd probably go with a user element, but not ads.
Yeah.
Maybe there are ads, bot-like ads or that kind of thing, but you get the podcaster to consume it.
Right. Because we grew a ton early from just sponsoring podcasts, whether it was Leo, whether it was Dignation.
They're back. Did you hear about that?
Sorry?
They brought back Dignation.
Really?
Yes. Like last week. You should give Kevin a call.
Okay. Yeah. So those were successful for us even to this day. The number one Google search that people do that end up at our website is CacheFly. Right? They're not going I need a CDN that does
Right.
this and let me learn about it. It's like they heard about us out there, right? And now they're like, okay, now I actually am in the market for CDN, so I'm going to Google CacheFly, and because it's easier than typing CacheFly.com. Don't ask me why. But the reason I ask that question is I still think the broader internet marketing world is still so sucked in by the fact that we can measure that it just doesn't there's so many missteps because you can measure. And the reason I say that, so in the late 90s, early 2000s, I had a company that we're not going to talk about, but we were fundamentally either an advertising play masquerading as M&A or the other way around. But ultimately we were selling ads on a network of websites. And the thing that blew my mind then, that still blows my mind mostly today, there's some stuff that's kind of closer now, is I said, no, but advertising the internet, it's it's pretend. It's not real. And I would know it's real when if I was an 18 to 35-year-old male and it was between the hours of 11 and 2, everywhere I'd go, I'd just see a picture of a Big Mac. There'd be no coupon there'd nothing to click. If I clicked it, it would do nothing. It would just be a billboard that followed me everywhere, and because I met a demo, or even not, just everybody between 11 and 2 in, some small town where the only place you can go for lunch is a McDonald's. It would just be like, here's a Big Mac, here's a Big Mac. Doesn't it look delicious? Not, if you click now, you can get a 2-for-1 special, and you just got to give us your name and your email address and it's so, everything is so click here so that we can measure whether this ad was good. And as opposed to just like, aren't you hungry? Wouldn't a Big Mac feel really good on your tongue right now?
Yeah, some magic gets lost in the art of tracking everything that moves.
Yeah.
But let's go full cycle. CacheFly sponsored Dignation, CacheFly sponsored Leo, CacheFly sponsored a bunch of them. I'm at the first podcast event, and I get a note that the guys from CacheFly, yes, guys, Matt and I have known each other for 20 years, get a note that the guys from CacheFly are buying dinner. And because I had seen CacheFly, and I didn't need a CDN, because I'd seen CacheFly at Dignation, because I'd seen CacheFly at Leo and all these guys, I'm like, wow, CacheFly. And you guys had you guys were the ones who made the shows I loved possible.
Yeah.
So as a result, there was a good place for you guys in my heart, and then I show up. So it wasn't, you certainly, we had no trackers at the time.
Yeah.
And we had no nothing at the time. I don't even know how you got my name to invite me to the dinner. Thank you for that. But
It's been 20 years. About time you said thank you. But yeah, go on.
There's room for that, and I think where the room for that is kind of a little bit what you're doing. I think there's room for it in I want to, what do you want the show to do? I want the show to give me a chance to have conversations with the people I like about the topics that matter, so that people can see how serious I am about this.
Right.
And someone who goes to, who looks up, episode 12 of season 2, where you interview a podcast that you and I don't even have on the podcaster list that we might want to interview list. Somebody looks at that and they look at all of season 1 and they look at all of season 2 and they that guy. Like he's intense. He goes deep on these issues, and we the CDN, there's this element that we're not ready for yet, and they might move over to it. It could be an interesting place. So I think that's there. But I think what happens is, I think if that's what you want, let's aim for it. Let's do it. Let's build for it. But again, in that, and we're working this out live here. I think you could do that, but you'd still want to track consumption.
Sure. Well, and what's interesting though is those early CacheFly reads were as follows: this episode of Dignation is brought to you by CacheFly.
Right.
That was it. That was the whole ad. It's not like, come here and you get like an extra special, and if you sign up now, this thing happens, and make sure you remember, code Dignation 17. It was just like, this episode is brought to you by CacheFly. And maybe you would still have accepted the invite to dinner if there was all of those things on every read about the coupon code and the whatever. But I thought it was way more effective for people to just be like, oh, CacheFly, you guys host whoever. Not, oh, CacheFly, you guys are the guys with the coupon code that'll give me, 15 extra gigabytes if I, give you my name and email address and sign up with the QR code, and, you're giving away an iPad for an extra review. And that's you can go so far down the rabbit hole of like if you measured the success of the McDonald's campaign as the number of people that saw the ad, immediately stopped what they're doing, got in their car, drove to McDonald's, ate food, came back, and resumed what they were doing, every ad campaign they've ever done would be unsuccessful.
Right.
And they all should have been canceled, and all marketing budget should have gone away, and the company's out of business because, hey, we decided what we wanted from this ad campaign was people to go eat McDonald's, and we measured it and nobody did. Except that same store sales were up 20%, month over month after airing it for a month or whatever. But nobody stopped what they were doing and immediately bought the supplements, or immediately
Yeah.
Like that's that to me. That's it's the
Yeah.
immediacy of the call to actions that I still feel like people get sucked in because you can,
Yeah.
therefore you
Yeah.
will.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I'm really just trying to say that like 20 years ago I had this really smart idea about McDonald's ads and they're still not happening. But
Right.
it still surprises me that McDonald's isn't just like, here's a Big Mac, an unclickable Big Mac
Right.
with like steam coming off of it, and then the fries come in from the side and they look like
Yep.
really
Yep.
fresh and hot, and that's
Mm.
that's all I need to know. That's to me that's going to send me to a McDonald's a lot more than a 2-for-1 small coffee
Right.
coupon because I gave them, my zip code and my email address.
In the app that you asked not to track. Yes.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, now again, easy to say because guess what? McDonald's is also spending in all those other channels, so that online, yes, maybe that's where they do want to capture coupons. But yeah, it's there's something seductive about instant measurement.
Something seductive about instant measurement. I would spend a while helping authors do the self-publishing thing on Amazon Kindle.
Mm.
And then Amazon KDP, the on-demand stuff. And now we're actually doing some stuff with audiobooks, funny enough. And people would look me straight in the eye and they would say, it's not like I'm expecting to get on the New York Times bestseller list. They're lying through their teeth. Like they really believe somewhere in their subconscious that if the book was finally made available at Amazon, they would be on the New York Times bestseller list.
Yeah.
People, I'm not saying I'm as good as Joe Rogan. Yeah, you think you're as good as Joe Rogan. And so there is an element at play here. I would go back. I would go back to the 4 questions.
Mm.
What do you want? I want a long play that isn't encumbered by coupon codes.
I want to sell more. I want to sell more hamburgers.
Yeah, but I want a long play of selling more hamburgers.
Right.
And the thing is, how you know that you're selling more hamburgers, well, we're not going to know for X amount of time, but here are the things, we do know, that, if that French fry going, and of course that's an immediately trackable thing, but like if I once, McDonald's, smart as they are, I read once that, remember the McDLT?
The McDLT.
That was the cold side cold and the hot side hot.
Oh yeah.
That was the gourmet burger.
Yeah.
They spent more money. Developing and advertising the McDLT than all of the Boston market chain would have cost them.
Right.
And all they wanted to do with the McDLT was have a grown-up burger option. They just wanted to have a place where grown-ups could go.
Yeah.
And they could have gotten that grown-up a lot cheaper if they just bought Boston Market.
Right.
And so I think you could say, I want a long play. And it's kind of what we're doing with this show.
Yeah.
You'll notice in the show there are no coupon codes for all the CDN.
I have nothing to sell. I have nothing to sell you,
Yes,
audience.
exactly. And but I think if you're honest with yourself at the beginning, I think you can do it. And then I think you can build it to the long-term sell.
Well, the thing is, I know that I'm just as good as Joe Rogan, so that as long as I'm not selling anything, then it'll take off.
Exactly. We dated this one a little bit at the beginning by talking about podcast movement, but there are other things happening in the news right now that we're not talking about, because hopefully this conversation about podcasting and long-term effects of it will be good in a couple of years. Maybe in 10 years, I can send Matt a copy of this episode on vinyl because everything sounds better on vinyl, knowing that day, it might be downloaded and listened to because, we start to consider these things. So I think it's doable. I think it's viable. I think the art of it's all there. I think there are some things you can track, but yeah, definitely don't. It isn't the only option.
Yeah.
It's a fun one, but it's not the only one.
Okay. So with that in mind, let's put something in the time capsule here. So, where are we in podcast evolution on delivering whatever it's meant to deliver? And where are we? So where are we from start to now? And where are we from now to 7 years from now? What's in front of us?
I think the mechanism is in play. I think we have everything we need to do what it is that we want to do. I think the language for what that means is not quite there yet. And I think the word podcast, and boy, speaking to Leo tried for a long time, netcasts you love from people you trust. I think we are at capacity, but we are not at general populist knowledge of what's available. If you look at the Edison research stuff they've done, they ask people, how many of you have listened to a podcast in the last month? And only 50% raised their hand, but then they mentioned 6 shows that are also podcast, and 65% of the people were, it was a show they didn't even realize it was a podcast. And so I think the language has got to change a little bit, and it's not the Anycast podcast. It's the Anycast available by podcast. It's the Anycast available by, at YouTube, and maybe we'll get it to IGTV and all those other platforms. So I think in 7 years there will be some variation of. Yeah, I was on a show yesterday, and it was two artists, music artists who I respect tremendously. And we're talking about how hard it is. It was a podcast where music artists were talking about how hard it is to get direct to their customer because of the Facebook algorithm and because of spam laws and because of all these things. I had to remind them, guys, a podcast comes spam free. If they're subscribed to your podcast, they will get the episode.
Right.
We don't get that anywhere else. And so there's some amazing stuff there. You leave your host, you leave your platform, you leave your things. You take all those clients with you. Not true in radio, not true in music, not true in anything else, book publishing, that type of thing. And so we have the tech. In the next 7 years, I think we're going to get the language to figure out what we can do with that tech and how that becomes. And we're gonna have the relationships directly with our audience. Not our YouTube audience, not our Apple Podcast audience, but our audience. They're going to know, if it drops from YouTube, it's probably something dumb happened, and they go check for me somewhere else. I think that's where it's going to be. Content delivered without a big blood-sucking corporation in the middle of it all taking a piece of the action. That is the future of media. And I think our audience are going to know that. We just got to have the words for that, because blood sucking just isn't quite in the vernacular where we need to go with this. I don't know. How's that? Thoughts?
It's precise. I agree. I think you're very correct about the language needing to change and the perception of what medium is, right? Like we are
Right.
recording this podcast on video, just as the original Dignation podcast was on video. But they're both podcasts, not shows. Or are they? Right? It is what you say it is. So yeah, I think the evolution of the language around it will have to change. I think in some level the and it will happen naturally as the different mediums change. But I think the technology part of it will fade away.
Yeah.
Right? Like even talking about RSS feeds, there's some intuitiveness still. If you go to subscribe, if my mom goes to subscribe to a podcast, she still feels like she's doing something a lot more complicated than turning on the radio.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Like when my mom doesn't call me and say, "Hey, good news, I turned on Drive Time Radio."
Right. Exactly.
She will call me and say, "Good news, I figured out how to subscribe to your podcast."
Yeah.
So there's still some level of society as a whole thinking this is still a technology thing, which a little bit of that is players, a little bit of that is integration, a little bit of that is language. So I think that will evolve. But more than anything else, I think in 7 years, I think you're right. It's just going to be the default way people get media out and consume media. And the exceptions will be, oh yeah, I watched that Netflix thing, or I watched that broadcast TV thing. But I think direct, for lack of a better term, direct to consumer is probably the way most things will start to be delivered, at least initially. And then the blood-sucking corporations might get involved once something has scale. But less gatekeeping, more capitalizing. Like today it's very gatekeeping.
Yes.
The blood-sucking corporations is like, if you're not on a big label, you're just never going to be popular. If you're not with a big publisher, you're never going to be on the New York Times bestseller list. As opposed to, ooh, we saw you were on the New York Times bestseller list. Hey, let's make a deal for your next book. Or
Yeah.
we saw that you were the number one stream on Spotify. Maybe now we can give you a record deal. So that's what I think. I think it'll change from gatekeeping to capitalizing.
Nice. And numbers wise, I don't know this for certain, but it sounds good, so I'm going to say it with authority. More people are going to have dinner tonight at Olive Garden in Portland than probably all the other Italian restaurants combined.
Right.
There's room for both.
Yeah.
And the people who are at Olive Garden, I heard a comic say like McDonald's isn't where you go for dinner, it's where you end up for dinner.
Mm.
And it might be the same sort of thing with Olive Garden. Nobody at Olive Garden is sitting down at their unlimited soup and breadsticks, option going, man, I wish we were at a more authentic restaurant tonight. They're at Olive Garden. That's what they want.
Right.
But the local Italian joint is not looking at Olive Garden as their competition. They're looking at the brew pub next door as their competition.
Right.
They're looking at Safeway out front, cooking the ribs on the grill, as their competition. So what's going to happen? Part of this growth is, yes, mom is needs to stop getting excited by this.
Yeah.
But also the idea of podcast versus this has to go away. One of the examples I always love to use is Seinfeld. One of my slides in the big presentation is, January 23rd, 1993, where were you? And it's a famous moment in our lives, and I ask people to predict and nobody knows. Do you know what it is, Matt?
I do not know.
It was the Marble Rye episode of Seinfeld. It was an important moment in history.
It was.
And the thing is, we remember the Marble Rye episode of Seinfeld. We don't remember the commercials that were on the Marble Rye episode of Seinfeld. And the commercials, when the Marble Rye episode of Seinfeld, I guess it's still on TBS. I'm assuming something here, but it's somewhere in the country. Marble Rye will be broadcast today,
Yeah.
and it'll be broadcast with commercials. But the money that Jerry makes from the Marble Rye episode is not some random station playing the repeat at this point. It's for the people who, man, Marble Rye, I forgot how good Seinfeld was. I should just buy the Blu-ray set for Christmas.
Right.
Or I'm going to subscribe to Netflix now for the next 10 months, because I want to binge watch all 11 seasons or whatever it was. But the big thing is, nobody, when I say Marble Rye episode of Seinfeld, I don't say Marble Rye episode of the Seinfeld television show that was on must-see TV, NBC Thursday nights.
Right.
The thing stands alone.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is the Anycast is going to stand alone. The podcasts are going to stand alone. The shows are going to stand alone.
I love it. Well, let's find out.
Let's do it. Well, all right. So wrap up. Season 2, it's going to be all about podcasts. You're going to interview podcasters from all walks of life. What are you looking for?
A good story. I'm super interested these days in how people got to where they are, specifically around doing podcasts, having a show, building an audience, having an audience. And what I think we're going to find by the end of it is, for however many episodes that we end up in season 2, there are going to be that many number of very different stories with some commonalities, right? Some conclusions that might be the same. But these are people that are choosing to put themselves out there in the world, and not only in the world, but on the internet, and have the comments and the reviews and all those things happen. So, it's still a pretty brave thing to do, to put yourself out there, I would think, especially when your name's on the show. And so a lot of these people, I think, are not necessarily trailblazers in the sense that we were trailblazers in 2005. But it's still a brave thing to do, and it's still early. And so I think the stories that got people to where they are, I think, are going to be really interesting. I think the predictions are going to be really interesting. And I think the random tangents and rabbit holes are going to be more interesting than everything else. So I'm excited.
So if someone wants their favorite podcaster to be interviewed on the Anycast, how should they reach out? Should they just comment below?
Let us know. Yeah, put it in a comment. We'll do our best. One of the things we talked about, I think, for season 1 was doing like an ice bucket challenge. So it's possible we might get guests to call out the next guest. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, if you're watching this or listening to this or consuming this in whatever way you consume this show, let us know if there's somebody you think would be a great conversation, and stay tuned for more great conversations.
All right, I'm going to ice bucket Dave Jackson, School of Podcasting,
There you go.
because he's been teaching people through all this time how to podcast for themselves. So the brave ones who are issuing out their voice, so many of them have been through Dave. So I think Dave will have his story to tell, and we'll have many stories to tell as well.
There you go. It's been laid down, Dave.
There we go, Dave.
Awesome. Well, Paul, thank you for your time.
Thank you, man.
We'll edit out everything we said, and
Be 5 minutes long.
Yeah, it'll be nice and short.
Yeah.
And after we get this saved this time, unlike the previous one, we'll get it published.
There we go. Thanks, Matt.
All right, Paul. Thank you.
This is different, another round, so much more to talk about. Gonna aim to satisfy with help from CacheFly. Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast. The Anycast podcast, brought to you by CacheFly.